The morning Calder Raines lost his job began like any other. Cold air rolling off Lake Erie, the distant groan of machinery, and the quiet rhythm of a man who had built his entire life around routine. For 22 years, he had walked through the same rusted gates of the steel plant in Lorain, Ohio, greeting the same faces, nodding at the same supervisors, and trusting that hard work meant security. That belief shattered in a 10-minute meeting inside a gray office with flickering fluorescent lights, where a corporate manager he had never met slid a thin folder across the table and calmly explained that the plant was downsizing. Calder didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, signed the papers, and walked out carrying a cardboard box with his lunch pail, a few photos, and a pair of worn gloves. If you've ever felt like everything you built can disappear in a moment, you'll understand why stories like this matter. So make sure you're following along, because this one doesn't go where you expect. By the time Calder reached the parking lot, the weight of what had just happened hadn't fully settled in. It hit him halfway home as he drove past the same diners and gas stations he'd known for decades, realizing he no longer had anywhere to be tomorrow morning. His wife, Marlene, had passed 3 years earlier, and his son, Everett, lived across the country in Phoenix, chasing a tech career that felt as distant as another planet. The house Calder returned to felt quieter than usual, as if even the walls sensed something had changed. He set the box down on the kitchen table, stared at it for a long time, then slowly opened the fridge out of habit more than hunger. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Later that evening, he sat on the porch, watching the sky dim into a deep gray blue, wondering how a man could give over 2 decades of his life to something that could let him go without hesitation. The days that followed blurred together in a way that only sudden unemployment can create. Calder tried to keep a routine at first, waking up early, making coffee, scanning job listings that didn't seem meant for someone like him. Every posting asked for skills he didn't have or degrees he never needed before. He drove into town a few times, stopping at places that might be hiring, but most conversations ended with polite smiles and promises to keep his application on file. It wasn't rejection that hurt. It was the quiet understanding that he no longer fit into the world the way he once had. One afternoon, he found himself parked near the plant, staring at the smokestacks rising against the sky. For a moment, he considered walking back in, not to ask for his job, but just to feel like he still belonged there. Instead, he stayed in the car, gripping the steering wheel, realizing that chapter of his life was already sealed shut. 3 days after he was fired, something unusual happened. Something small enough to ignore, yet strange enough to linger. Calder had gone to a local hardware store to pick up a few things he didn't really need, just to feel productive. As he stood in the aisle comparing drill bits, a man he had never seen before approached him. The stranger wasn't dressed like anyone from town. His coat was too clean, his posture too deliberate, his eyes sharp in a way that made Calder feel like he was being studied. The man didn't introduce himself right away. Instead, he glanced at Calder's hands, the rough skin and old scars that told their own story, and then said quietly, "You've spent a long time working with steel, haven't you?" Calder frowned slightly, unsure how to respond. But before he could say anything, the stranger added something that made his chest tighten just a little, as if the world had shifted by an inch without warning. Calder didn't answer immediately, not because he hadn't heard the question, but because something about the way it was asked didn't feel casual. The man's tone carried a quiet certainty, like he already knew the answer and was simply confirming a detail. Calder finally nodded, keeping his voice measured as he said, "Long enough." The stranger gave a slight smile. Not warm, not cold, just precise, and extended his hand. "Name's Dorian Voss," he said, his grip firm but controlled. There was no introduction beyond that. No explanation of why he cared about Calder's past, just a steady gaze that made it clear this wasn't a random conversation. Calder had met plenty of people in his life, managers, inspectors, union reps, but this felt different, like he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite see yet. And if you've ever had one of those moments where something small feels like it's about to change everything, you already know why this story is worth sticking with. They moved their conversation toward the front of the store, away from the hum of other shoppers, and Dorian spoke in a way that felt both direct and strangely careful. He mentioned the plant without Calder bringing it up, referencing its production lines, its shutdown rumors, even the specific section Calder had worked in for years. It wasn't guesswork, it was knowledge, detailed enough to make Calder's shoulders tense slightly. "You were let go 3 days ago," Dorian said, not as a question but as a statement. And for the first time, Calder felt a flicker of unease. "I keep track of industries," Dorian continued, as if that explained everything. "More importantly, I keep track of people who know how to work with their hands, people who understand precision without needing to be told twice." Calder shifted his weight, glancing toward the exit, half considering ending the conversation, but something kept him there. Curiosity maybe, or the quiet sense that walking away might mean missing something he didn't yet understand. Dorian didn't rush. He let a few seconds pass, almost like he was measuring Calder's reaction before speaking again. "I represent a private group," he said, lowering his voice just enough to separate this from the normal noise of the store. "We acquire and restore specialized equipment. All systems, industrial components, things most people overlook because they don't recognize the value." He paused, watching Calder closely. "We're not looking for engineers with degrees on paper. We're looking for people who've spent years doing the work, who can see what something is worth without needing a manual." Calder crossed his arms slightly, still guarded but no longer dismissive. "And you think that's me?" he asked. Dorian didn't hesitate. "I know it is." There was no sales pitch in his voice, no exaggerated enthusiasm, just a calm confidence that made it harder to brush off. What came next was the part that didn't quite make sense at first. The part that lingered in Calder's mind long after the words were spoken, and reached into his coat and pulled out a small plain envelope, the kind that looked almost out of place given the weight of the conversation. He handed it over without ceremony. "Inside is an address," he said. "If you show up tomorrow at 9, you'll get the details. If you don't, nothing changes. You go on looking for work, and we find someone else." Calder turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling its lightness, wondering why something that seemed so ordinary suddenly felt important. As he looked back up, Dorian added one final line, his voice steady and unmistakably serious. "If you do come, understand this isn't a job offer in the usual sense. It's a decision, and it's worth $5 million, if you're the right man." Calder stood there for a moment longer after Dorian walked away, the envelope resting in his palm like it carried more weight than paper should. The noise of the hardware store slowly returned around him, the distant clatter of carts, the hum of fluorescent lights, but it all felt slightly muted, as if he were listening from underwater. He turned the envelope over again, noticing there was no name written on it, no markings at all, just a clean seal. For a man who had spent his entire life trusting routine and predictability, this felt like stepping into something undefined, something that didn't come with instructions or guarantees. He slipped it into his jacket pocket without opening it, almost as if doing so in public might somehow change what it meant. On the drive home, his hands stayed steady on the wheel, but his thoughts kept circling back to the same question. Why him? People didn't just walk up to strangers in hardware stores and offer them decisions worth millions of dollars. Not in his world, not in the life he understood. That night, the envelope sat on the kitchen table untouched for hours, positioned exactly where Calder had placed it when he got home. He moved around it without thinking at first, heating up leftovers, rinsing a plate, flipping on the television only to mute it moments later. The house felt heavier than usual, filled with the kind of silence that makes every small sound stand out. Eventually, he pulled out a chair and sat across from the envelope, studying it the way he might have studied a piece of machinery he didn't recognize. His instincts told him to be cautious. Nothing about this felt normal. But another part of him, the part that had spent years solving problems with his hands, felt drawn to it. Finally, he reached forward and opened it carefully, sliding out a single folded sheet of paper. Inside was an address, printed neatly, along with a time, 9 a.m. No company name, no instructions, no explanation. Just a location that, as he quickly realized, wasn't anywhere he'd ever been before. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Calder lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of streetlights slipping through the curtains, his mind replaying every detail of the encounter. He thought about the plant, about the years he had given to something that ended without warning, and about how quickly everything had shifted since then. Part of him considered ignoring the whole thing, treating it as some kind of elaborate mistake or even a scam, but that explanation didn't quite fit. There had been no pressure, no urgency in Dorian's voice, just an option, presented with a kind of confidence that didn't feel desperate or rehearsed. Around 3 in the morning, Calder got up, walked back into the kitchen, and looked at the address again. It was real, at least on the map he pulled up on his phone, located about 40 minutes away in an industrial area he had no reason to visit before. He stood there for a long moment, then quietly set his alarm for early morning without fully admitting to himself that he had already made a decision. By the time the sun rose, Calder was dressed and out the door, the envelope tucked securely in his jacket like it belonged there. The drive felt longer than it should have, each mile carrying him farther from the life he had known and closer to something he couldn't define. As he followed the directions, the surroundings began to change. Fewer houses, more empty lots, and eventually, a stretch of land dotted with old warehouses and fenced-off properties. The address led him to a large, unmarked building set back from the road, its exterior plain enough to go unnoticed if you weren't looking for it. There were no signs, no logos, just a wide metal gate that stood partially open. Calder slowed the car as he approached, his instincts urging caution, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he drove through the gate and parked near the entrance, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. For a moment, he stayed seated, looking at the building, aware that whatever waited inside was about to change the direction of his life in a way he couldn't take back. Calder stepped out of the car slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his boots echoing louder than it should in the still morning air. The building in front of him didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look active either. It existed in that strange middle ground, like something waiting rather than operating. The metal door at the front was slightly ajar, just enough to suggest he wasn't the first to arrive. And as he approached, he noticed faint sounds from inside. Low mechanical hums, distant movement, nothing distinct enough to identify. He paused at the threshold, one hand resting briefly against the cold surface of the door, feeling a hesitation he couldn't quite explain. This wasn't fear in the usual sense. It was something quieter, a recognition that stepping through meant committing to whatever came next. After a few seconds, he pushed the door open and walked in, the dim interior swallowing the morning light behind him. Inside, the space opened into a vast warehouse floor, far larger than the exterior had suggested. Rows of equipment stretched into the distance, some covered in heavy tarps, others exposed, revealing complex assemblies of steel, gears, and components Calder didn't immediately recognize. The air carried a mix of oil and dust, but nothing felt neglected. Everything was too orderly, too deliberate. Overhead lights flickered to life, section by section, as he moved forward, as if responding to his presence rather than operating on a fixed schedule. A few figures were scattered across the floor, each focused on their own tasks, none of them looking up right away. Calder took it all in with a trained eye, noticing details automatically. The condition of the metal, the alignment of parts, the subtle signs of recent work. This wasn't a storage facility. It was something else entirely, something built around precision and purpose, even if its exact function wasn't obvious. Right on time. A familiar voice said from behind him, and Calder turned to see Dorian Voss stepping out from between two rows of machinery. He looked exactly as he had the day before, composed, controlled, like a man who rarely needed to adjust himself to fit a situation. Most people hesitate at the door, Dorian added, walking closer, his eyes briefly scanning Calder's expression as if taking note of something. Calder didn't respond right away, his attention still partially on the equipment around them. "What is this place?" he finally asked, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. Dorian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for Calder to follow, leading him deeper into the warehouse, past machines that looked decades old yet carefully maintained, and others that seemed almost experimental in design. "It's a place where value gets recognized," Dorian said after a moment, his tone even, "where things and people that are overlooked elsewhere get a second look." They stopped in front of a large, partially disassembled structure that dominated one section of the floor. It wasn't a single machine in the usual sense, but a combination of systems, layered and interconnected in a way that suggested both age and complexity. Calder stepped closer without being asked, instinctively drawn to it, his eyes tracing the lines of metal, the worn edges, the subtle modifications that hinted at years of adaptation. "This isn't standard," he muttered, almost to himself, reaching out to touch a component before stopping just short, as if respecting something unspoken. Dorian watched him carefully, a faint hint of satisfaction crossing his face. "No, it's not," he replied, "and that's exactly why you're here." Calder glanced back at him, a question forming before he even spoke it, but Dorian raised a hand slightly, cutting him off in a calm, controlled way. "Before we talk about the 5 million, he said, his voice lowering just enough to sharpen the moment, "I need to see if you understand what you're looking at, because everything depends on that." Calder leaned in closer to the structure, his eyes narrowing slightly as he began to study it the way he had studied every complicated system he had worked on for over 2 decades. At first glance, it looked like a mismatched assembly of industrial parts, sections that didn't belong together, materials from different eras, even different purposes. But the longer he looked, the more a pattern started to emerge. The alignment wasn't random. The wear on certain joints suggested repeated use under pressure, while other components looked almost untouched, as if they had been added later to stabilize or enhance something older. He moved slowly around it, crouching slightly to examine the base, then stepping back to take in the entire structure. "This wasn't built all at once," he said finally, more certain with each word. "It was adapted, over time. Someone kept changing it, improving it, but not replacing the core." His voice carried a quiet respect now, not just curiosity. Whoever worked on this knew exactly what they were doing. Dorian didn't interrupt, letting Calder process the machine in his own way, as if this moment mattered more than any explanation he could offer. "Go on," he said after a few seconds, his tone encouraging but controlled. Calder hesitated briefly, then pointed toward a section near the center where several reinforced plates had been welded together. "This is where it matters," he continued. "Everything feeds into this point. Whatever this system does, this part handles the stress, the real load. And it's been reinforced multiple times, not because it failed, but because whoever was running it kept pushing it further." He straightened up, wiping his hands unconsciously against his jeans, even though they weren't dirty. This isn't just old equipment someone kept around. It's something that was important, valuable enough to keep modifying instead of replacing. He looked back at Dorian, his expression sharper now. "So what exactly does it do?" Dorian took a step closer to the machine, his gaze resting on it for a moment before shifting back to Calder. "That," he said, "is the right question, but not the first one you needed to answer." He folded his hands loosely, as if the outcome of this conversation had already been decided somewhere in his mind. "Most people who walk in here see a pile of outdated hardware. Engineers see inefficiency. Investors see scrap value. You saw continuity, purpose, and intent." There was a pause, not dramatic but deliberate. "That's why you're still here." Calder let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, though the uncertainty hadn't gone away. "You still haven't told me what it is," he said, not pushing, just stating a fact. Dorian gave a small nod, acknowledging the point without rushing to answer it. "Because understanding how to look at it matters more than knowing what it does," he replied. "The wrong person with the right information is useless. The right person can figure out what they need." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the warehouse filling the space between them. Then Dorian reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a thin tablet and handing it to Calder. The screen lit up as soon as it changed hands, displaying a series of schematics and data points that seemed to map directly onto the machine in front of them. "Here's where the decision comes in," Dorian said, his voice steady, but with a subtle shift that made the moment feel heavier. "What you're looking at isn't complete. It hasn't been operational in years, not fully. We've preserved it, studied it, but we haven't been able to bring it back to what it was designed to do." He watched Calder closely as the information sank in. "If you can figure it out, if you can make it work again, then the $5 million is yours. Not as a salary, not as a reward, as a transaction." Calder's grip on the tablet tightened slightly, his mind already racing through possibilities, even as one thought stood out above the rest. This wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about understanding something that had been deliberately left unfinished.
Calder stared at the tablet for a long moment, the schematics shifting slightly as his fingers brushed the screen, each layer revealing deeper complexity. It wasn't just a blueprint. It was a timeline of changes, annotations from different hands, some precise and technical, others almost hurried, as if written in the middle of a breakthrough or a crisis. He recognized certain patterns immediately, the kind that came from years of instinct rather than formal training. But there were gaps, too. Places where information simply stopped or had been intentionally removed. That absence bothered him more than the complexity itself. "Someone didn't want this to be too easy," he said quietly, half to himself, his eyes still scanning the details. He could feel the pull of the problem now. The same pull he used to feel when a system wasn't behaving the way it should. A need to understand it, to solve it. Not for recognition, but because leaving it unfinished didn't sit right with him. Dorian watched without interrupting, giving Calder the space to think, which in itself felt like part of the test. "You're noticing the missing pieces," he said after a moment, his voice calm but observant. Calder nodded slightly, finally looking up. "It's not just missing," he replied. "It's selective. Whoever worked on this knew exactly what to leave out." He turned back to the machine, walking a slow circle around it again, now cross-referencing what he saw in front of him with what was on the screen. The alignment between the physical structure and the digital schematics wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to suggest intention rather than error. "This wasn't abandoned," he continued. "It was paused." The word hung in the air, carrying more weight than he expected. Dorian's expression didn't change much, but there was a subtle shift, a quiet confirmation that Calder was moving in the right direction. "What happens if it runs?" Calder asked, not looking at Dorian this time, his focus still locked on the system in front of him. There was a slight pause before the answer came, not because Dorian didn't have one, but because he seemed to be choosing how much to reveal. "It completes a process that was never finished," he said finally. It wasn't a full explanation, but it wasn't meant to be. Calder exhaled slowly, processing that, knowing it raised more questions than it answered. "And the $5 million?" he asked, his tone steady, grounded in practicality despite everything. Dorian met his gaze directly now. "It's the value of that process being completed," he replied. "To us, It's worth far more. To you, it's a fixed number, clear and immediate. There was no exaggeration in his voice, no attempt to make it sound bigger than it was. If anything, that made it harder to dismiss. Calder lowered the tablet slightly, his thoughts shifting from analysis to decision. This wasn't like applying for a job or taking on a contract. There were no timelines, no clear expectations, just a problem and a reward that felt almost unreal compared to the life he had been living a week ago. He thought about the plant again, about how easily everything he had known had been taken away, and how little control he had in that moment. This felt different. Uncertain, yes, but also deliberate, like a choice that belonged entirely to him. He looked back at the machine, then at Dorian, and for the first time since this had begun, there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "If I take this on," he said, "I do it my way. I don't rush it, and I don't guess." Dorian gave a small, almost approving nod. "That's exactly why you're here," he replied. And in that quiet exchange, without any formal agreement or signature, the decision was made. Calder didn't waste time asking for formalities or contracts after that. Instead, he moved instinctively toward the machine, setting the tablet down on a nearby metal surface, as if he had already accepted that this place was now his workspace. The shift in him was subtle but undeniable. Where there had been hesitation before, there was now focus, the kind that narrowed his world down to the problem in front of him. He began by tracing the outer framework again, this time more deliberately, mapping out in his mind how each section connected, how stress would move through the structure once it was active. The longer he studied it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about repairing something broken. It was about understanding the intent of someone else's thinking, someone who had built and modified this system over years. Calder had always been good at that, seeing not just what something was, but why it had been made that way. And as he worked, the uncertainty that had followed him since losing his job began to fade into the background. Dorian didn't stay close the entire time. At some point, he stepped away, leaving Calder alone with the machine and the quiet hum of the warehouse, as if the real test required space rather than supervision. Hours passed without Calder noticing them in any meaningful way. He moved from one section to another, occasionally picking up the tablet to cross-check a detail, then returning to the physical structure to confirm what he suspected. He found small inconsistencies that others might have overlooked, slight misalignments, components that had been adjusted just enough to change how force would distribute under pressure. None of it was random. It all pointed toward a system that had been pushed beyond its original limits, then carefully reinforced to handle something more demanding than it was ever designed for. At one point, he paused, leaning back slightly, his brow furrowed as a realization began to form. Not complete yet, but close enough to feel. By late afternoon, Calder had isolated what he believed was the central issue. Not a missing part in the traditional sense, but a disconnect between two key sections that were meant to operate in perfect synchronization. The schematics hinted at it, but the physical machine confirmed it. A timing imbalance that would prevent the process from completing, no matter how well the rest of the system functioned. "It's not broken," he murmured, almost unconsciously. "It's out of sequence." Saying it out loud seemed to lock the idea into place, and for the first time, he felt a sense of direction rather than just exploration. He began mentally working through possible solutions, none of them simple, all of them requiring careful adjustment rather than brute force. This wasn't something he could fix by replacing a part. It required understanding the rhythm of the machine, the way each movement depended on the next. As the overhead lights gradually shifted to a softer tone, signaling the approach of evening, Calder stepped back from the structure, wiping a hand across his face as he processed everything he had uncovered so far. That was when he noticed Dorian again, standing at a distance, watching without interrupting, as if he had been there longer than Calder realized. "You found something," Dorian said, not asking, just acknowledging. Calder nodded slowly, his eyes still on the machine. "It's close to working," he replied. "Closer than you think, but whoever set this up left it just slightly off. On purpose, I think." He turned to face Dorian fully now, the weight of the realization settling in. This wasn't meant to be finished by just anyone. Dorian's expression remained composed, but there was a quiet intensity behind it now. "No," he said, his voice steady. "It wasn't." And in that moment, Calder understood that this wasn't just about solving a technical problem. It was about stepping into something that had been waiting for the right person to see it through. The realization settled deeper into Calder's mind as the evening stretched on. Not as a sudden shock, but as a steady, undeniable truth that reshaped how he saw everything in front of him. This machine wasn't simply left unfinished. It had been deliberately held at the edge of completion, like a test waiting for the right set of hands. He walked around it again, slower this time, almost with a sense of respect, noticing details that now carried new meaning. The reinforcements, the adjustments, even the missing data points in the schematics, all of it pointed to someone who had understood the system completely and then chosen to stop just short. Calder found himself wondering about that person, about what had made them step away, and whether they had known someone else would eventually pick it up. For the first time since arriving, the problem didn't feel isolated. It felt connected to a larger story, one that extended beyond the steel and components in front of him. He picked up the tablet again, scrolling through the layered schematics with more intention, focusing not on what was there, but on what was absent. Patterns began to emerge in the omissions themselves. Sections where data stopped at critical points, notes that hinted at adjustments without explaining them fully. It wasn't random, and it wasn't incomplete in the way unfinished work usually was. It was curated. They wanted whoever came next to think, Calder said quietly, almost as if the person who had built this could hear him. He began mapping out the sequence in his head, aligning the physical movements of the machine with the partial data on the screen, filling in gaps not with guesses, but with logic shaped by experience. Each connection he made tightened the structure of his understanding, turning something abstract into something tangible. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't easy, but it was clear.
Dorian stepped closer again, not interrupting, but no longer keeping his distance either. "You're seeing it the way it was meant to be seen," he said, his voice low enough to blend into the quiet of the warehouse. Calder didn't look up immediately, still focused on the alignment he was working through. "It's not just about fixing it," he replied. "It's about finishing someone else's work without changing what they intended." He finally turned, meeting Dorian's gaze with a steadiness that hadn't been there before. "If I'm right, the sequence isn't off because of damage. It's off because it needs to be recalibrated in a very specific way, something you wouldn't catch unless you understood how all these pieces depend on each other." Dorian gave a slight nod, as if confirming a conclusion rather than hearing it for the first time. "And if you can do that?" he asked, not as a challenge but as a continuation of the path they were already on. Calder looked back at the machine, the answer forming without hesitation now. "Then it runs," he said simply. There was no need to add more to it. The implication was already clear. He took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the task settle into something manageable, something real. This wasn't about chasing the 5 million anymore, not in the way it had seemed at first. It was about solving something that mattered, something that had been waiting to be completed. Still, he was aware of what completing it would mean, of how quickly his life could shift again, but this time on his own terms. He set the tablet down and stepped closer to the central section of the machine, his hands hovering just above the metal as if preparing for the next move. "I'll need time," he said, his voice calm but firm. Dorian didn't argue, didn't negotiate. "You have it," he replied. And with that, the work truly began, not as a test anymore, but as a process that was finally moving toward completion. Time stopped feeling like something Calder measured in hours and started feeling like something he moved through without noticing. The outside world, days, nights, whatever was happening beyond the walls of that warehouse, faded into irrelevance as his focus narrowed completely onto the machine. He worked in long, uninterrupted stretches, stepping away only when his body forced him to, then returning with the same quiet determination. The adjustments he made were careful, almost surgical, each one based on hours of observation and thought rather than impulse. He didn't replace parts unless it was absolutely necessary. Instead, he realigned, recalibrated, and refined, treating the system as something that already knew what it was meant to do. Over time, the machine began to feel less like an object and more like a conversation, one where every response he made revealed something new in return. What changed most wasn't just the machine, but Calder himself. The uncertainty that had followed him after losing his job had been replaced by a sense of purpose so steady it almost surprised him. For years, his work at the plant had been repetitive, defined by schedules and instructions, but this was different. Here, every decision mattered, every detail carried weight, and the outcome depended entirely on his ability to understand something deeply rather than simply operate it. There were moments when he would pause, step back, and take in how far he had come, not in distance, but in clarity. The gaps in the schematics that had once seemed like obstacles now felt like deliberate guideposts, leading him toward the final sequence he needed to complete. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was precise. Dorian remained present, though never intrusive, Sometimes he would appear quietly at the edge of the workspace, observing without comment, then disappear again just as silently. Other times, he would ask a single question, never to direct Calder, but to understand how he was thinking. "You're close," he said once, his voice low, almost blending into the ambient hum of the warehouse. Calder didn't respond right away, his eyes fixed on the central assembly as he adjusted a component by a fraction of an inch. "Closer than yesterday," he finally replied, not looking up. It wasn't confidence in the usual sense. It was something steadier, built on the accumulation of small, deliberate progress. The machine was no longer resisting him. It was aligning with him. Then came the moment when everything seemed to settle into place, not with a dramatic shift, but with a quiet certainty that no further changes were needed. Calder stood still for a long time, looking at the system as a whole, mentally running through the sequence he had reconstructed piece by piece. There were no loose ends left, no unanswered questions in his mind. For the first time since he had stepped into the warehouse, he wasn't thinking about what might be wrong. He was thinking about what would happen when it finally worked. He glanced toward Dorian, who had already stepped closer, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. "It's ready," Calder said, his voice calm but carrying a finality that hadn't been there before. The words didn't feel like a conclusion. They felt like the start of something that had been waiting far longer than Calder had realized. Dorian didn't respond immediately, not because there was doubt in Calder's words, but because the moment itself seemed to demand stillness before anything else. He stepped closer to the machine, his eyes moving across the structure with a level of attention that matched Calder's own, as if confirming something far beyond visible alignment. Calder remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the process he had just completed. The warehouse felt quieter than it ever had, the low hum of distant systems fading into the background as everything narrowed down to this single point in time. "Then let's see it," Dorian said finally, his voice steady, giving nothing away. Calder nodded once, turning back to the central controls, his hands moving with the same deliberate precision that had guided every step up to this moment. He initiated the sequence slowly, not rushing through any step, allowing each part of the system to respond exactly as it was meant to. At first, the changes were subtle, a shift in tension, a low vibration moving through the framework, components engaging one after another in a rhythm that felt almost familiar now. Then the machine began to come alive in a way that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. The synchronization he had worked so carefully to restore held steady, each section feeding perfectly into the next, the entire structure operating as a single, unified process. Calder watched closely, not celebrating, not reacting outwardly, just observing with the quiet focus of someone who understood how easily things could still go wrong, but they didn't. The sequence continued, building toward something that felt less like a mechanical outcome and more like the completion of an intention that had been waiting for years. When it reached its final phase, there was no explosion of sound, no dramatic display, just a controlled, precise completion that left the machine in a state of perfect stillness. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Dorian exhaled softly, the smallest shift in composure finally visible. "It's done," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of what had just happened. Calder stepped back, his eyes still on the system, letting the reality settle in. Everything he had worked through, the uncertainty, the missing pieces, the deliberate pauses left by someone else, had led to this exact result. He hadn't just repaired something, he had finished it, exactly as it was meant to be finished. Slowly, he turned to face Dorian, not expecting praise, not even expecting explanation, just understanding that whatever came next would be as deliberate as everything that had come before. Dorian reached into his coat one last time, pulling out a document and placing it in Calder's hands with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning. "5 million, he said simply, as agreed. Calder looked down at it, not rushing to react, because the number itself no longer carried the same weight it once had. It wasn't just money, it was proof of a decision he had made when everything else in his life had felt uncertain. "What was it for?" Calder asked after a moment, his voice steady, finally returning to the question that had been there from the start. Dorian met his gaze, and for the first time, there was something almost reflective in his expression. "A process that couldn't be automated, replicated, or forced," he replied. "It required judgment, patience, and experience. Things no system can replace." He paused briefly, then added, "We weren't just restoring the machine. We were proving something about the people who still matter." Calder nodded slowly, taking that in, understanding that the answer was complete, even if it didn't explain everything. As he stepped away from the machine, the warehouse no longer felt like an unknown space. It felt like somewhere he had passed through, something that had served its purpose in his life at exactly the right moment. The loss of his job, the unexpected encounter, the decision to walk through that door, it all connected now in a way that didn't feel accidental. He walked out of the building the same way he had entered, but nothing about him was the same anymore. The future ahead wasn't defined by what he had lost, but by what he had proven to himself. If this story stayed with you, take a second to like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment with your thoughts. And if you want more stories that hit like this, make sure you're subscribed, because sometimes the biggest changes come from the moments you almost walk away from.